Each time that I think you go, I turn around and you're creeping in, and I let you under my skin, 'cause I love living in the sin. Oh, you never told me true love was gonna hurt, true pain I don't deserve, truth is that I never learned. I keep going to the river to pray, 'cause I need something that can wash out the pain, and I know I'm slipping all these demons away, but your ghost, the ghost of you, it keeps me awake. I keep going to the river to pray, 'cause I need something that can wash out the pain, and I know I'm slipping all these demons away, but your ghost, the ghost of you, it keeps me awake. Give up the ghost, give up the ghost, give up the ghost, stop the haunting, baby. Give up the ghost, give up the ghost, give up the ghost, no more haunting, baby.
Dann wird es rote Rosen regnen. Willst du mit mir Drogen nehmen? Dann wird es rote Rosen regnen. Willst du mit mir Drogen nehmen? Dann wird es rote Rosen regnen. Ich hab's in einer Soap gesehen. Willst du mit mir Drogen nehmen? Willst du mit mir Drogen nehmen? Dann wird es rote Rosen regnen. Ich hab's in einer Soap gesehen. Willst du mit mir Drogen nehmen? Willst du mit mir Drogen nehmen?
All right, everybody, please take your seats. We're already late. I hope you're all awake. All right, I have a few announcements, particularly for scholarship recipients. Be sure to check out at the registration sometime during the day or sometime during the afternoon. And also for scholarship recipients, if you haven't already given your thank you card, please do so. For everybody, please don't talk amongst yourself loud because we can hear it on the live stream. So people have been complaining about that. So. At the first coffee break this morning at 10:30, we're gonna have a group photo. We've tried to find a place where we can get a little bit of a beautiful view we have of Prague. So let's all gather in the foyer and take a group photo at 10:30. And then you can grab a coffee after and come back. So another thing, we want to start some activism. In America, we have something called a street team, ARI street team, which is like people who want to get involved and do something active to promote objectivism in their own countries. We want to do it a bit more coordinated in Europe now, and since we have representatives from so many countries, we suggest that during the lunch break, Tal would like to meet with you guys and hear your opinions. Everybody who is really dedicated to doing something. If you would meet us at lunch, also by the great view, with Tal and discuss what kind of activism you can do in your country. We're going to start monthly webinars, either with Tal or someone else from ARI. So that's one thing that we're going to give to you, and we'll see if you can get a crowd together in your country, your city, to watch it and discuss it afterwards. So we'll go, for instance, through OPAR or something like that. So let's discuss it over a sandwich at lunch. And there are also, on the registration, we moved it out there, there are some leaflets about, it's our startup manual. It's how you start up something in your community and how we at ARI can help you with books, with pamphlets, with material in general, and also there's a little bit of money somewhere to start up something locally if you want. So please grab one of those, and the bookmarks and everything, student postcards are free, of course, they are in the registration desk. So, okay, let me introduce you to our first speaker this morning, Ben Bayer, who's a fellow at Ayn Rand Institute and also an OAC instructor. So some of you might already know him. So here's Ben.
Thank you, Annie. Is this thing on? Can everybody hear me? We're all good? Good. So my topic today is free will and individualism. In order to show you how this topic connects to the theme of the conference, Tribalism, I want to take you back to an essay that's come up several times in the conference so far this weekend. We've referenced several times this essay of Ayn Rand's called Global Balkanization, which is really her seminal statement on the dangers of tribalism. Yesterday, during his speech, Dr. Brooke said that she says some very stunning things in this essay, stunning in terms of about the spread of tribalism in her day and prospects for the future. I want to share with you a passage from this essay, which when I read it for the first time, I found especially stunning, and I think some of you will see why. Here is what she said. And here she tells us what balkanization is. It's the breakup of larger nations into ethnic tribes. This term was used as a pejorative term by European intellectuals. Those same intellectuals were pathetically proud when they managed, after World War I, to glue most of the Balkan tribes together into countries like Yugoslavia. But the tribes never vanished. They have been popping up in minor explosions all along, and a major one is possible anytime. She wrote this in 1977. I read this for the first time in 1995, and this was, of course, during the height of the Yugoslav Civil War, which would eventually end the lives of up to 140,000 people, displace maybe 4 million people. And I thought at the time, how did she manage to guess that something like this could happen? And I think it's important that it's not that she was some kind of prophet, and she herself emphasized that she didn't think that this was something that was inevitable, determined to happen in the course of history. So how was she able to guess that it could happen? There was some potential that she had identified that was in play. And I think the main potential she identified here was certain philosophic ideas. In the first talk yesterday, Onkar Ghate identified some of the main philosophic ideas at work behind collectivism generally, but especially tribalism. And today I want to drill down into one of these especially potent philosophic ideas. And to do this, I actually do want to start by dwelling a bit more on at least some of the ideas that were at work, as far as I can tell, behind the Yugoslav Civil War. And I want to emphasize up front that I think that in this war, as I'm sure many of you know, there was probably blame to go around on all sides of the conflict. But I do want to consider, just for the sake of example, some of the prominent Serbian nationalist beliefs that were frequently cited as justifications for the war. And I think it's well known and well documented that these were some of the justifications. And I want to consider them because I think they're rather revealing for our topic today. And it's certainly not the case that all Serbs thought these things or that all Serbs were in favor of the war. But consider, for example, how certain Serb nationalists wanted to blame the Croatians and make them pay for the sins of their fathers. The Croatians who were involved in the Ustashi Nazi puppet regime during World War II. And it's certainly the case, I think, that the Croatians were complicit in any number of war crimes during World War II. They helped run concentration camps where perhaps up to 100,000 people were killed. But it was 50 years prior to the Yugoslav Civil War. Or consider how, again, Bosnian Muslims were thought to have to pay, this time for the sins of their fathers very long ago, the Ottoman Turks, who had occupied Southeast Europe for some 500 years. And there was one particular grievance that was cited, especially in the late 80s, early 90s. Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic actually gave a whole speech in front of 1 million Serbs in Kosovo, talking about the Battle of Kosovo, which happened in 1389, and the Serbs lost to the Ottoman Turks. One of the things that aggravated this issue in particular was the belief at the time that Albanians in Kosovo were out-reproducing the Serbs, giving birth to more Muslim babies who would replace and threatened to replace the Christians in the province. And this was especially aggravating because it was thought by certain nationalists that there was something inherently unnatural about someone who spoke Serbo-Croat adopting anything other than Christian beliefs. And so the question here is, what do all of these beliefs have in common with each other? And I think that if you think about it for a while, you'll see what it is. Especially when you're regarding these attempts to repay the sins of the fathers. There's an assumption at work that people inherit the moral character of their ancestors. I mean, why else would you hold people responsible for something that they didn't themselves do, but which happened either 50 or maybe 600 years ago? Why else would you be frightened that they might intend to do the same thing again, unless you thought that there was some aggressiveness or tendency to violence that they inherited from their ancestors? Also, especially with reference to the whole concern about reproduction and birth, there's this assumption that people inherit something like the beliefs of their ancestors, the religion of their ancestors, that you can give birth to a Muslim baby, or that there's something about being a Serb or a Croat that means you are naturally Christian. This is a common view about religion, not just something in the Balkans. Onkar referenced this just the other day when he talked about how his teachers were debating about whether or not he was born as a Protestant or a Catholic. You certainly hear that Jews believe that you inherit Judaism genetically. I believe that Muslims think everyone's born Muslim, and part of this is, but some version of that is especially at work behind the view that President Obama was a Muslim, just because his father was Muslim. These are all forms of a particular philosophic viewpoint, which Onkar referenced briefly, but which I want to talk more about today, a philosophy called determinism. Determinism is the view that your thoughts and your actions are determined by forces beyond your control. This is the view that you have no free will. And in these examples, these are forms of what they call genetic determinism, the idea that the forces beyond your control are some distant events that happened to your ancestors or actions that your ancestors undertook, which were transmitted genetically to you, which affected either your moral character or your belief system. And this is a key philosophic assumption behind all forms of collectivism. And the point is not so much that various partisans in this war had studied philosophic texts and become convinced by philosophers to become determinists. It's rather more of a philosophic viewpoint that's adopted by a certain kind of default. By not thinking a whole lot about it, by absorbing ideas passively from a culture around one. We'll come back to how that happens and why that's not itself a deterministic explanation in a minute. But just in case if you're wondering if these beliefs are just beliefs held by certain crackpots who happen to have influence in this part of the world. I'll just show you one particularly dramatic version of this view. Consider the words of one Biljana Plavšić, who was the president of the former president of the Republika Srpska, which is the sub-entity in Bosnia that the Serbs were in control of. And she was herself a biology professor at the University of Sarajevo. And she was asked at one point why it was the Bosnian Serbs didn't want to negotiate with the Bosnian Muslims, why it was they wanted to fight with them instead, especially when they were their own countrymen, they spoke the same language, they looked the same. And this was her answer. She said, "It was genetically deformed material that embraced Islam. And now, of course, with each successive generation, this gene simply becomes concentrated. It gets worse and worse. It simply expresses itself and dictates their style of thinking and behaving, which is rooted in their genes." I mean, think about how you would feel if you really thought that some group of people that you lived close by with had some genetic defect that dictated the way they thought and behaved. And you thought this was a defect that made them aggressive. You would be frightened, and you would perhaps be hateful. And that's apparently why this particular president wanted to fight, and why many others did as well. This is a kind of motivation that I think Ayn Rand was able to project among those who adopted these deterministic tribalist beliefs in that essay, Global Balkanization. And I want to show you another passage from that speech and that essay. Earlier, Onkar had referenced a quotation from it in which Ayn Rand talked about how if men believe that they're helpless, if they think that they are impotent to use their minds to understand reality, then they'll be pulled to join some kind of group, and especially some group that's based on unchosen characteristics, ethnic characteristics. I want to show you another passage that follows that, where she talks not about the person who believes in determinism's view of themselves, but of others. And what she says here is, if a man believes that his own character is determined at birth in some unknown, ineffable way, and that the characters of all strangers are determined in the same way, then no communication, no understanding, no persuasion is possible among them. Only mutual fear, suspicion, and hatred. And she goes on to discuss how she thinks that because of this, tribal and ethnic warfare is usually the most atrocious kind. This is something I think that's important to remember when you're thinking about what it means to be an individualist by reference, by contrast with a collectivist. The way that collectivism is often sold by its advocates is in a way very different from the way it presents itself to the world. Here's the way it's often sold. The idea is you are a cell in some larger organic unity that's working together for a larger purpose, kind of like this famous illustration from Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, where each little person goes to form this massive unity of the that forms the state, and it's all directed by a head, and it all works in common, united purpose. But a more realistic translation of what collectivism looks like is something like tribalism, where the relevant analogy is not this unified organic entity, but more like something like a pack of wolves. You are a member of a pack of animals driven by instincts to get in fights with other such packs. Why is this? Well, Dr. Salmieri, I think, did a good job summarizing some of the reasons for it. If you think that your mind, the contents of your mind are not ultimately up to you to control, your reason isn't competent to assess the facts because it's programmed, and you think other people are like that, then since reason is the currency for harmonious commerce among men, it's what makes true unity of purpose possible. If you don't think that that's possible, no unity of purpose and harmony is possible either. And I think this is one of the important things that helps explain why it is that all the grandest collectivist efforts in history, especially the various experiments with communism and socialism in Europe, ultimately resulted in the collapse into ethnic and tribal warfare, not just in the Balkans, but in Central Asia and the Caucasus and any number of other places where communism collapsed. So the question then is, what is the alternative? And I think one way of thinking about this is, if we're individualists, there's a question of what is it that individuates an individual? What is it that separates us ultimately from other individuals? And I think it's important, and Ayn Rand had a very distinctive view here, that it's not enough to consider how we are physically separated from each other. We're all different physical entities. Because, of course, the way that determinists see it, that's true enough, but one force or another keeps us connected to each other without our choice through some kind of remote control. This came up yesterday when we talked about Nietzsche. Nietzsche, even though he's sometimes confused with being an individualist, thought we were nonetheless determined by some force called the will to power, which courses through each and every one of us and bids us to try to overpower others. And of course, the tribalist, ethnic, racist version of this is that people are pulled together by common fear and hatred of other groups, sort of, again, by remote control, even though they're physically separate. What we need to be real individualists is to be able to follow a separate path in life. You need to consider yourself as having free will. Free will is the capacity by which your thought and action is determined not by your genes, not by your upbringing, not by your environment, but by you. You can do otherwise. You face choices in life. You can go down different paths, even different paths completely separate from the people who are otherwise regarded as being a member of your tribe. Now, there are a lot of questions to ask about what this would really mean. The worry that some people have is that if we have free will, we do things for no reason whatsoever, which would make it look like we were all insane. But Rand's view has a very distinctive answer to this question. In her view, it's possible to choose your actions for a reason and for them still to be free, provided that you are freely choosing the reason for your action. And I want to give you just a quick example to try to illustrate this idea, using a very concrete choice of action that might have been made, let's say, between the tribalists and the individualists. A tribalist is somebody who wants to attack the other tribe. An individualist is somebody, let's say, who chooses to trade peacefully with them. Well, they don't make these choices blindly. They do have reasons for them. Why does somebody want to attack somebody else? Because they feel fear, because they're angry. Why does somebody want to trade peacefully? Well, because they feel goodwill toward the other. Why do they feel the things they feel? Ayn Rand had the view that our feelings are themselves products of our beliefs and our ideas. So perhaps you feel angry or hateful towards someone else because they don't believe in the God that you believe in, and you think that faith is a virtue, and this person is insulting your faith. Versus, if you feel goodwill toward them, it may be because you see they're the kind of being that's open to persuasion, open to reason, and you place a premium on the value of reason. Now, I don't think this fully gets to the bottom of what it means to be able to choose your reasons. We still need to say, well, what is it that makes the difference between adopting one set of values and adopting another? We certainly don't experience ourselves as just waking up in the morning one day and deciding I believe in God or I don't believe in God. And if you don't believe in God, I couldn't make you switch it on just even by offering you a reward. Rand had an answer to this question. And it has to do with what she took to be the really distinctive source of our control over our lives. For her, it wasn't primarily control over our actions or over our feelings or even over our beliefs. It was a control that we have over the operation, the activity, the processing of our mind. In choosing to turn on that operation, she thought, we thereby would choose the reasons and the values and the feelings and the actions. And I want to summarize this view for you with a quotation from her here. She said, "That which you call your soul or your spirit is your consciousness, and that which you call free will is your mind's freedom to think or not. The only will you have, your only freedom, the choice that controls all the choices you make and determines your life and your character." Think about it just with reference to one example. Think about it with reference to your parents say there's a God. Do you accept what they say just because it's what your parents say and you've always accepted your parents? You don't want to rock the boat. It's comfortable to believe what they give you. Or do you ask questions about it? Do you try to see if you understand what it means to say that there's a God? Do you try to consider what the evidence would be for it? Do you have reasons of your own? Or if politicians are blaming outsiders for some kind of problem, do you ask for the evidence for that? Or are you contented to be comforted by being able to blame somebody else for your problems? These are the kinds of questions that you can either ask or not ask, as you choose to think or not, as you choose to focus your mind or not. And these are questions that can make a difference. The more of these questions that you ask, the more you try to understand what it is you're believing before you believe it, the more you come to value the power of reason. The less you do it, the more you're afraid of those who ask questions, those who think maybe just differently from you. And I think the more you're motivated to act on that fear. If you want a really good portrayal of this distinction, I do recommend reading Ayn Rand's novel, The Fountainhead, where the difference between Howard Roark and Peter Keating, Howard Roark being the first-handed person who chooses to think consistently, Keating being the one who kind of passively absorbs the views of his environment, doesn't. And this is the kind of view that Ayn Rand is also summarizing when she says, the use or misuse of his cognitive faculty determines a man's choice of values, which determine his emotions and his character. It is in this sense that man is a being of self-made soul. This is the respect in which one controls the content of one's character, as Dr. Ghate was discussing yesterday. Now, unfortunately, in my opinion, I think too many of today's thinkers reject a belief in free will. They believe, and here I'm thinking of people like Sam Harris and Steven Pinker, they think that it's incompatible with science. They think that it's acausal, it's supernatural, it's mysterious and mystical. And I don't want to go in right now in interest of time to the full answer to these questions, but I do want to indicate very briefly that there are answers that Ayn Rand gives. She thinks that free will is not only not incompatible with science, but that it's a prerequisite for scientific objectivity. You need to be able to think, to choose to think or not, if you want to criticize anyone for not thinking, for being unscientific, for being prejudiced. And she thinks that free will is a part of a natural biological capacity, your own consciousness, one that you can observe with your own eyes, just like scientists do, except you have to turn your eyes inward and introspect and consider the difference between what it means to think and not. And I'd be happy to answer more questions about the common objections to free will in the Q&A. But these are important questions to think about and ask, because determinism is empowering today's tribalism just as much as it has in the past. We see tribalist activism all over the place today, especially on college campuses. And deterministic viewpoints are empowering these kinds of activism on both the left and on the right. So we have, for example, the alt-right activists who think that intelligence and civilization are purely genetic. And that's clearly a form of genetic determinism. But on the left, the progressive left, there's the view that intelligence and civilization are purely so-called social constructs. This is much of the worldview that's behind the intersectionality idea that Dr. Brooke talked about. This is the alternative that you're often given between nature and nurture. It's either nature or nurture. And it's important for Ayn Rand that there is a third alternative, that free will is a third alternative, and it's an alternative that's especially important to consider and embrace, I think, in this day and age. And I'll close by giving you something that I think maybe will inspire you to take the issue of free will seriously. And it's the way that Ayn Rand closes her essay, Global Balkanization. She says, if you want an example of what had once been the spirit of America, a spirit which would be impossible today, but which we must now struggle to bring to a rebirth. I will quote from an old poem that represents the opposite of the abject self-abasement of ethnicity. It's a poem called The Westerner by Badger Clark. He begins with, "My fathers sleep on the eastern plain, and each one sleeps alone." He acknowledges his respect for his forefathers, then says, "But I lean on no dead kin. My name is mine for fame or scorn, and the world began when I was born, and the world is mine to win." And I think we have the opportunity to win a world for ourselves today. When people talk about the Yugoslav Civil War, for instance, it's often chalked up to ancient ethnic hatreds. And sometimes there's actually a deterministic gloss that explanation is given, as if people in the Balkans were inherently more tribalistic than people anywhere else, and they're expected to fight wars. But that's not the case. And Ayn Rand's view is that everyone has free will. And I'm totally encouraged by the fact that we have people not only from all over the Balkans here, but from all over Europe, from all over various nations which used to once be at war with each other. And I think that it counts as a little rebellion against the tribalism of all of our ancestors, our own little Prague Spring. Let's not let the determinists suppress it this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. So we have time for questions. If anyone wants to come and line up for questions here. We don't have a lot of time, but I think we can take 4 questions probably.
Okay.
Hi. I'm not a physicist, but how could you justify free will from physics, from the perspective of physics? Because, I know that from the objection of Laplace. Do you know Laplace? Okay. How could you reply to the objection of Laplace?
So this is a version of one of the 2 points I had on the slide about how there's a belief that if you accept free will, you have to accept something that's unscientific, that goes against the law of cause and effect. And that's something that, of course, the success of modern physics to a great extent is based on. And Ayn Rand has a whole view worked out on this topic, a view of the relationship between free will and causality. And one of the issues is that it's important to understand the law of causality in the precise way. And so the view here that is not that free will is a causal. We do have a choice. But if you have a view of causality that's the view that all cause and effect relationships are like relationships between billiard balls, where there's one event and then another event, and each event is caused by antecedent factors, then yeah, it's going to be difficult to make sense of the idea of free will. But there's a broader conception of causation, which Ayn Rand, I think, inherits from the Aristotelian tradition, which says, no, cause and effect, causality is the way in which a thing's actions are determined by its nature. And here, there's no inconsistency. The fact that human beings have free will is a fact about our nature. We, in fact, must make choices. Now, which choice we make is up to us. But I think that there's already plenty of reason to think that an overly narrow mechanistic conception of causation is not the obvious way to interpret all of the findings of modern physics. There's interesting questions you can ask about, for instance, what's happening on the quantum level. And I'm not a physicist either, so I'm not going to say anything more about that. But the view here is that there is causation. It is the causation by which one determines one's own action in accordance with one's nature. And I'd be happy to talk more about this with you offline.
Thank you.
I'm not a physicist as well, but just to answer the question, in the quantum world, there is a lot of non-determinism. We can't really prove that free will really exists, but we say that it's better to live life like it is. Why isn't the same argument works for believing in God?
So the viewpoint here is not that we should believe in free will because it's better to believe in free will. Though I think I can see maybe why you might have gotten that from some things I said in the speech, because I am discussing the dangerous consequences of a belief in determinism. But that's a consequence. That's not the primary issue here. And the primary that I alluded to was that the way that you know you have free will is by noticing the difference between how sometimes you're able to control sometimes you're in charge of your thinking, sometimes you're focusing your mind, sometimes you're actively attempting to figure out what's true, and sometimes you're not. And so that's not some kind of act of faith. That's a matter of observing your own mental life. And it's also important that in Rand's view, and this relates to the question about whether, in what sense, free will is scientific, I mentioned her view was that it's the prerequisite of the possibility of talking about scientific objectivity. So it's true that, importantly for her, you can't prove free will, but that's because free will is the presupposition of being able to prove anything. The idea that it's good to prove things, that it's good to have evidence, presupposes that you've got a choice about whether you're going to try to prove something or not. You've got a choice about whether you're going to try to look at the facts or not. And so that's very much presupposing the idea that it's important to use reason and not, for instance, faith. And it's a separate discussion, I think, of whether or not you could give an argument for the existence of God. I don't happen to think that any of them work. That's something you can't just take my word on, but we could talk about that later if you wanted to as well.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
My question is in the role of independent thinking. Do we have free will or we do not? So think about a company like Facebook or Coca-Cola. They actually know information about you that you do not know, which is based on studies probably, which mean that they can manipulate us according to the unknown desires that we have within us. So when we are in control and when we are not.
I think we had a conversation about this
so,
earlier, but
yeah.
I mean, so one important general point, I think, is that I mentioned how Rand thinks that the basic choice is to try to figure out what's true or to simply passively accept ideas and values from around you. And one interesting consequence of this view is that for those who don't choose to think, for those who don't try to figure out what's true for themselves, there is a sense in which they're sort of allowing themselves to be determined by their environment. And it is possible if you just, I don't know, become a kind of mindless consumer, to let yourself be pushed around by emotionalistic arguments that advertisers use for why you should buy a certain product. But the main and important thing is that you don't have to do that. You don't have to let that happen. And I think any number of us are aware of cases where we're tempted to buy something because it looks like it would be fun, but then we think about it and we say, well, I can't do. How important is this? Am I just acting out of instant gratification? Do I have the money for it?
Which is based on information that we already have. It's already in our mind, and then you just keep going. And exactly, like we can be rational, but the question is when we are in control and we were not. So that's like the question I'd like to have an answer.
I mean, it's certainly true that whenever we make a choice, in the best cases, we are bringing to bear the information we've already acquired in life. But the point is that that's a choice we still have to make. We may have acquired knowledge in the past, but we don't have to bring it to bear, and all too often people don't. And this relates to something that we talked about earlier. The view here is not that everything that you do in every respect is entirely determined by your choice ex nihilo. But there is something that you can do that is up to you, that draws on things that build on your past choices and sometimes build on things that aren't up to you. I mean, there is such a thing as genetics. There is such a thing as your upbringing.
Which means that if it's not up to us, there's no free will. And it means like it's an illusion that we create in our mind, that we think we can, but it's based on information that we have perceived already from, like people can manipulate us easily. I mean, we can be strong and, rational sometimes, but I mean, the human being is still sometimes not at its best. And you can see that like in Facebook, you can see people writing comment. And of course, like, that's not a good example, but
maybe we should talk about this more later, but I do think it's important that we don't, to be in control of our lives, it's enough that we are in control of one crucial thing that has effects on other things. And that's what Rand thought the choice to think or not was.
Thank you.
Hello. So, do you think problems Balkan actually have are mostly connected with, let's say, first of all, because they are like really religious people, at first place Orthodox or Muslim, or because of ones who are, let's say, fundamentalists of their religion, or those who are religious in public but definitely not religious for themselves?
I mean, it's easy, I think, to see that some of the worst problems in the world, some of the worst forms of ethnic violence, come from people who take their religion really, really seriously, for sure. And this isn't about any one particular religion, right? There's, as you mentioned, several usual suspects, and they're very different religions, and there's long histories of religious warfare on all fronts. But I don't think that that means that it's only the so-called fundamentalist religious who are the ones that are the only problem. I'll just give you one example, and I think you can think about this. In the West, for instance, there is, I mean, obviously there's a threat that we face, and we're going to be talking about it in future sessions, of Islamist terrorism. And you might want to just blame the fundamentalist Muslims. But there's also, I think, blame to go around coming from Christians who, because they believe in their Christianity, and because they believe in turning the other cheek, and because they think we should love our enemies, who are therefore unwilling to face that threat and unwilling to fight. And they may not be directly responsible for the crimes we're talking about in the way that the actual terrorists are, but my institute has argued over the years that this Judeo-Christian view of the morality of self-sacrifice is what's often responsible for weakness in and empowering and appeasing various other kinds of terroristic threats. That's just one example, and I think there are many others like it, examples in which people you might think to be the moderate religious are nonetheless responsible for problems as well, and we could talk about others, but yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you for keeping the questions brief, and thank you, Ben, for a great talk.
Thank you.
So as I take the stage, let me introduce to you our next panel. And we have Onkar Ghate, whom you met yesterday, our Ayn Rand Institute chief philosopher and senior fellow. We have Gregory Salmieri, who also gave a... No, he's going to give a talk today. Sorry. You gave a talk yesterday. Sorry. So let me introduce you the third person whom you haven't seen here before. So this is Flemming Rose, who's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. As a journalist, he was a foreign correspondent in Moscow and Washington, D.C. In 2005, he published cartoons depicting Muhammad in the Danish newspaper Jyllandsposten. That sparked quite a controversy. It inspired Flemming to write a book called The Tyranny of Silence, how one cartoon ignited a global debate on the future of free speech. And Flemming is a long-time friend of Ayn Rand Institute. He's done several events in US and Europe with our speakers, particularly on free speech. So we welcome you, Flemming. Thank you for coming here. So I hand it over to you guys.
Hello. I think what we'll do is, can I be heard? It doesn't. Okay, good. Thank you. So we're going to talk about free speech. We want to keep a lot of time for questions, I think, so we'll make a few opening remarks. Maybe I'll start. Flemming, do you want to go second then? You can go third. And I wanted to situate this issue within the theme of the conference of individualism in the age of tribalism. I think of free speech and the battle for free speech and the historic battle for free speech as one of the high water marks in the fight for individualism. So free speech becomes an ideal that people are crusading for, again, in the Enlightenment. And I think it's important to think of it in that wider context. And it's a battle. The Enlightenment was a battle for reason, and that we can live by reason, and that each individual can live by reason. And part of then the ideal that is being formed is the whole idea of the rights of the man. You can put it now as individual rights. And crucial among that was if we're going to be able to live by reason, we have to have intellectual freedom. And part of it will be put in the Enlightenment, and if you think of the Declaration of Independence as one of the great documents that comes out of the Enlightenment period, the rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. The property is not in the Declaration of Independence, but it's in other writings at the time. And the right to liberty, part of what that means is freedom of thought and freedom of speech. And I think you should think of those two as they're together. You need to be able to think for yourself and to discuss ideas with other people. And that if you're to be able to pursue and arrive at the truth for yourself, you have to have the freedom to go wherever your mind wants to go and thinks, look, I need to look into this to figure out the issue. And particularly if individualism is about deep thinking, and part of what we've been talking about and part of what I talked about yesterday, is that you have to be able to examine and re-examine very deep, challenging, controversial issues, such as religion and morality. And you have to be able to ask questions about this. And I put up on the slide a Socrates and a Galileo. And they're both persecuted by authorities for daring to go and think forbidden thoughts and to discuss forbidden thoughts. And if you're really to be able to pursue the truth, there can't be authorities like that who have been granted the power to police ideas. And so in that context, it's such an enormous positive. It was such a fight to get to the point that one has this right that is now being protected by the authorities, rather than the authorities dictating what you can and cannot think and what you can and cannot discuss. And when you look at many of the Enlightenment figures and thinkers, they're on the run from authorities who are trying to persecute them for the ideas that they're holding and discussing. And if you look at, almost every of the Enlightenment figures at one time or another is on the run from the authorities. So if you take your own individualism seriously, this is a right that I think you should think of as it's integral to my ability to think, to pursue the truth, to reason. And it's something, therefore, that I have to be willing to fight for. And we're now living in an age where it's become increasingly under attack that one should have this right. And let me make one last point. Attacks on an individual right, usually, and this was a point Ayn Rand made, I don't think she's the only one to make it, they usually start with the least attractive practitioners of the right. So if you think in regard to free speech, one of the things was I said last time I'm from Canada, the Holocaust denial. So this is a viewpoint, and it's a false, or you even glorify it to say it's false. It's a completely arbitrary viewpoint. It's a conspiracy theory. So it's a vile viewpoint. So you can have both an intellectual and moral evaluation of it as it's false or it's detached from reality, and it's really, really bad. And yet, you still, if you're going to fight for this as a right, you still have to fight for that. The right encompasses that kind of activity. But it's not the reason one demands the right to think for oneself and to speak for oneself. You're doing it in the name of the pursuit of truth. There are people who will abuse that. And it's part of the right that they're protected in that abuse. And there's all kinds of things including arguing about these people, talking about them, exposing them, that one can do. But it's the attacks always say, well, look at this really questionable activity that someone's doing when they're exercising their right. And you can't allow that to swamp the reason the right exists in the first place. Okay, let me pause there. Flemming, do you want to?
Hello. Okay. First, thank you for the kind introduction, and it's nice to be here with my old friends from Ayn Rand. I will just make a few remarks, and then I'm looking forward to the exchange with you. First, I think it's fair to say that the idea of freedom of expression is maybe the most powerful idea ever invented in the history of mankind. But at the same time, it's also maybe the most counterintuitive idea, in the sense that most people, the vast majority of people, they want freedom of expression for themselves, but not for the people with whom they disagree. And in that sense, freedom of expression is more the exception than the rule when you look at human history and the way human beings and societies have behaved throughout history. And in that sense, we are living in very good times if you compare to the Enlightenment that Onkar spoke about, and earlier or later times, and other parts of the world today. So we have to have in mind that free speech is something that we can never take for granted. It's something that you have to take. It's not a thing that you will be given by anybody. You have to fight for it in order to sustain it. And that's an understanding that is not that widespread anymore in the West. And I think that's one of the reasons why free speech is in decline, even in liberal democracies in the West. If you look at Freedom Forum's annual reports, or Reporters Without Borders, or other international surveys, you can see that the respect for freedom of expression and freedom of the press has been declining for some years now. And why is that? Well, I already said that I think it has to do with the fact that people do not, they take freedom of expression for granted, and they are not willing to stand up for it when it has a price. But I think what generally has changed in the world over the past 20, 30 years is that we are now living in a globalized world, which means that most societies in the world are becoming more diverse in terms of culture, ethnicity, and religion. That goes for Denmark, it goes for Russia, goes for Southern Europe, Northern Europe, Asia, and so on and so forth. People with different lifestyles, people believing in different things, committing themselves to different ideas, are living side by side in the same societies. And at the same time, we have the digital technology. That means that we are not only becoming physical neighbors with people who are different from ourselves, we are also becoming virtual neighbors through gadgets like the smartphone. And because we prefer freedom of expression in a broad sense for the people with whom we tend to agree with, or with the people who we feel some similarity with, freedom of speech is by definition coming under pressure as diversity grows. And I think the cartoon crisis that I was involved in is a very good example. It all began with the fatwa against Salman Rushdie in the West. in fact, 30 years ago on Thursday. So I think it's a great occasion here to have the fatwa as some kind of starting point for our debates about freedom of expression and Islam and immigration. So what to do? I think basically you can go two ways with this growing diversity and the kind of insult or grievance fundamentalism that we are experiencing, that a lot of people are playing the grievance card when they are confronted with ideas and speech they don't like. And a lot of people believe that they do have a right not to be offended. And I don't like to offend other people. I like to be polite, and I like when people are talking nice to me. But in this world of diversity, we will from time to time offend one another because we believe in different things. So if you follow this way, if you respect my taboo, I respect yours. If you will not criticize and say bad things about what I believe, I will not criticize and say bad things about what you believe in. That sounds very nice, but it will end in a tyranny of silence, because as we are growing more and more diverse, there will always be people out there who are offended by what we say. So I think that is a very unfortunate way to go, even though on the surface it may sound very nice and comfortable. The other way to go is to ask ourselves, what are the minimal limitations that we need on speech in order to be able to live together in peace? And I think the key limitation on free speech is incitement to violence. I can maybe come up with a few more, but that is the key limitations that we have to accept. Apart from that, I think people should have a right to say more or less whatever they want. And I'll be happy to elaborate later in the session. Thank you.
Yeah. So I just want to, is this on? 1, 2, are we good? Okay. They were trying to silence me. So I just want to say a word or two about what I understand the right of free speech to be, and then elaborating on some of what Onkar and Flemming said, what I take some of the present threats to be to it. So a right, as I talked about yesterday, is a principle that defines your freedom of action in a social context. So you're in a society, it defines the sphere in which you should be able to act unilaterally without anyone's permission. And then the role of a government is to protect that right rather than to violate it. So there are two parts to that right: to not infringe, not stop you from taking actions within that sphere where you have that freedom, and also to protect you when somebody else tries to infringe on that sphere, right? So if somebody wants to attack your newspaper because you've published some cartoons, the police, the government's job is to stop them from doing that or attack you. And we have to present an example of that in Flemming's case. So that's what the right is. And rights are about creating a situation, preserving and creating a situation in which people are able to interact solely voluntarily. So that when I do something with you, whether it's agree to have a conversation, or I publish something and you're going to buy it, or I buy something you're publishing, or I interact on your social media platform, when I get into a relationship with you, that relationship only happens because both of us choose it. We're not operating under threat of getting assaulted if we don't be in this relationship, or if we don't be in it in a certain way. So that's what the right of free speech is. And I want to distinguish that from any protocol of decorum or rules that a certain organization might have about what gets done. Someone rented us this conference hall, and they might have rules about what we can and can't do in the conference hall. If you run a newspaper, you have an editorial policy about what you will and won't publish. If you're a social media platform, you have a content policy, and it might be a good or a bad content policy about well thought out or not well thought out, about what kind of content you'll allow on your platform. If you have a page on Facebook, now you're not the people who run Facebook, there's a guy with a Facebook page, you might have some policies personal informal ones, or just make decisions about what things you'll allow in comments on your posts, and you'll delete someone's comment if it says something that is outside of your view of what they should be saying. None of that is a violation of free speech. That's an exercise of free speech. It's your making choices, Facebook's making choices, the newspaper editor's making choices, the venue owner making choices about who he's going to associate with, what kind of speech he's going to be party to and endorse. It's his exercising his voluntary choice in the realm of ideas, and it's that choice, or that choice is part of what is protected by the right to free speech. What violates the right to free speech is two things. One, when the government passes laws constraining what you can and can't say. Not Facebook deciding what you can and can't say on Facebook, not YouTube deciding what it'll monetize or demonetize, not a television station deciding what it will or won't have on the television station. Right? It's when the government passes laws saying you can say this and you can't say that. That's one, and those laws are enforced by force. Someone will come and arrest you or fine you if you say the wrong thing. And the other thing is when somebody, in effect, acts like a vigilante. They think they know what the law should be, that you shouldn't be able to blaspheme the prophet or use certain gender pronouns for certain people, or whatever the thing might be. And if you say that thing, they're not going to wait for the police to arrest you because they know the police won't. They'll take it on themselves, and they'll beat you up or shoot you or bust into your satirical magazine and kill everybody. Right? Those are the things that are violations of free speech, not you don't like that your boss won't hire you if you have a certain political view, whether or not the boss's decision is good. So that's just underscoring what I think free speech is and what it isn't. Then a word or two about present threats to it. Well, I've mentioned a few already in passing. That is, some movements that I think want to put people down, stop them from speaking. We already mentioned the Islamist movement, and particularly the jihadi form of that movement, where people are, the Islamist movement is the movement to try to impose religious Islamic rule by force in the government. So they want a government that, among other evils, violates free speech. And then the jihadi movement is the movement that says we're not going to wait until that government exists. We're going to start trying to enforce what we think its laws should be with guns in the streets of Paris and New York and wherever else we can do it. So that's one. Also, I think some of the leftist movements that when people speak in ways they don't want to, they have mobs. So if Milo Yiannopoulos or Ben Shapiro or somebody wants to speak at Berkeley, they don't just let it be known that they don't care for his speech and maybe they'll boycott the university, but they break things and burn things. Or if Charles Murray speaks at a college, they attack and someone gets hurt, right? So these are, or Antifa broke into an event that Yaron Brook did and stormed the thing and they hurt one of the security people, I don't think very seriously, but this is force, right? So that's one threat, movements of people who want to suppress speech by violence and who indeed are taking it into their own hands to do it. The other two major threats I see, they're related, are the lack of clarity and the ever-growing lack of clarity about the distinction I was making before about what is and what isn't freedom of speech. So people who feel that their freedom of speech is being violated when a company has policies that they don't care for about what can be said on the page of that company. And so they want to, for example, regulate Facebook because they don't think its platform is neutral, which means that what they want to do is, and I think Dennis Prager is an example of such a person, but there are others, they want the government to come in and start controlling what Facebook or YouTube, it's YouTube in Prager's case, can and can't do, can and can't let be said on its platform. They want to violate Facebook and YouTube and all these companies' free speech in the name of, quote, free speech, namely the fact that they think they're owed a platform to say whatever the hell they want on, whether or not the owners of the platform want them to. So that is the attempts to violate free speech in the name of free speech. And then a third that's related to that and related to the theme of our conference here is a real tribal character in the thinking about this. So free speech is starting to be seen now as a right-wing issue by some, in quotes, right? It's a right-wing issue. It's, why? Because some right-wingers are concerned about some left-wing attacks on free speech, and so then it's associated with the right that they're pro-free speech. But the problem is that the right-wingers who think of it in that way are not really defending free speech, or many of them are. They're not defending, for example, YouTube's right to have whatever policy it wants with respect to its content, whether or not they themselves think it's a good policy. but rather they're defending the right of people in their group, ideological group, to say the things that they want to say, and not the right of other people to say the things they want to say, or have their platforms designed to promote the ideas they want and not others. So the idea of a too narrow or an incorrect view of what free speech is on the part of the defenders of free speech. And this is not a new phenomenon. In the 60s, we had quite a lot of this phenomenon on the left, where people were criticizing television stations for violating people's free speech because they didn't have enough leftist views in certain situations. And there are particular examples of that we could talk about. But we're seeing it now, I think, on both sides of the aisle, but this particular problem, I think, a little more on the right wing these days.
So let's open it up for questions, discussion, and again, if you can come to the mic over to the side of the room, that's great.
Thank you. Is it on? Thank you for opening statements, and I believe I want to ask the question that you already touched a little bit, but still it's a very important nature for me because I'm from Ukraine, and as you know, my country is at war with Russia right now, and even more than it is the war of armies, it is also an informational war. And Russian government constantly disseminates fake information about our government, tries to portray Ukraine as failed state in order to take us over, and which in turn, puts in danger our freedom, and not just freedom of speech, but all freedom we have and our democracy. So I want you to elaborate on the point that can you limit the freedom of speech in order to defend the freedom as a whole?
I think in that kind of context, I would not think of it as you're limiting freedom of speech in order to defend freedom. So I do think there is an issue of, you can put it as Russia propaganda, that this is, it is an issue for the government to address. You're dealing with a foreign power that is trying to, it's trying to undermine your form of government. And it's the similar issue in regard to the Russia propaganda in the US. Now, I don't think this propaganda had some kind of decisive impact on the election and on the political system, but it is something that a government should be trying to ward off and defend against. And I don't think of that as a limitation of free speech. And you're trying to do it in a way that will not limit or infringe upon the free speech of your actual citizens in your actual nation, but that if you're trying to combat the propaganda and the attempts to undermine your very system of government by a foreign power, I view that as a foreign policy issue, that it for sure is the responsibility of a proper government to try to address and stop or at least mitigate to the extent it's possible.
I would, do you want to go first?
I think there are historical analogies that may be relevant to the situation in Ukraine or in the West as general, speaking about the current conflict between Russia and the West, the Cold War. And during the Cold War, we also had that internal debate, how far to go in limiting the free speech of the groups, parties, publications that were on the other side, and in some cases not exactly on the other side, but committing themselves to ideas similar to the ones being promoted by the Soviet Union. And I think the lesson we learned from the Cold War was that it's better for a liberal democracy to stay committed to its principles than sacrificing them. For instance, you had Joseph McCarthy in the US in the 50s who set up committees very similar to things that were going on in behind the Iron Curtain and trying to shut down dissent because some people were in favor of socialism. And I think that course was very wrong. In Denmark during the Cold War, we had a communist party that was loyal to Moscow. We had a communist newspaper that probably was supported with money from Moscow. We had unions controlled by the Communist Party, and so on and so forth. We had schools based on socialist principles. And of course, that was very unpleasant for somebody like me, who were close to a lot of dissidents in the Soviet Union. But I think the lesson is that we prevailed. We were able to defeat the other side in this war ideas. And I think in Ukraine, I think it's wrong when the Ukrainian government is trying to ban Russian publications. I think it's wrong when the Ukrainian government is trying not to let Russian literature into the country. This is not because this is being promoted by Moscow, but because there are people in Ukraine who see themselves as Russians, who speak the Russian language, who identify with Russian literature, and so on and so forth. And I think it will serve your interest in the long run not to limit democracy too much in order to save your national independence. It's a very difficult line, and especially difficult because you have so little time with you have had so little time establishing democratic institutions, and Russia has infiltrated so many institutions in Ukraine. But nevertheless, I think it's very, very important to stay committed to liberal and democratic principles if you want to survive as a democratic nation in the long run.
Yeah, my sense is that the primary role of a government in combating the type of thing we're talking about, which is propaganda by foreign governments, is exposing it. So it's not to outlaw or police the expressions of certain opinions, or even expressions of opinions influenced by or in some sense taken from the talking points of foreign powers, but to expose the fact that the foreign government has a propaganda operation, to point out as a matter of foreign policy, this is what they're doing, this is where these points are coming from, publish documents alerting people to that fact, investigating any covert networks in the country that have actual loyalties or ties or are taking money from foreign powers that we're at war against, and therefore that interaction with should be banned. But just investigating that and bringing it to light, but not saying you can't then say these things if you're not saying them on the payroll of a foreign power. And then lastly, exposing any things that are crimes and would otherwise be crimes apart from the free speech issues that then are going into providing propaganda talking points. So for example, if Russia hacks American political parties or governmental officials, and that's already an illegal action, and steals information and then uses that information in a propaganda war, prosecuting the people involved in the hacking. And treating it as a attack by a foreign power in cyberspace, the hacking. So those are the things I think that should be done in general to protect against this, rather than banning the promulgation of even particular publications that are propagandistic. Do you have a different view of what the proper and improper state actions to combat it is?
Well, I think it's important that the exposure includes the attempt to stop it when it's clearly done by the foreign power. So if you can cut off the funding from Russia, and I mean, so they talk about the intelligence agencies now engaged in this kind of warfare. But it is, like, I think the government is trying to stop it, not just expose it, But it can't stop it by violating the rights of the citizen. So you can't say to the citizen, you can't hold these ideas, you can't talk about these ideas. But I think that's very different than saying, you can't take money from Moscow.
Right.
I think it really poses a fundamental question for any democracy, and that is the so-called balance between security and freedom. And that has been a challenge for democracies all the way through history. And we have to keep in mind that dictatorships will always justify limitations on our freedoms with reference to the need for security. And I think there is a risk that the Ukrainian government will use this to clamp down on their political opponents and say, well, they are, Putin's puppets, or it's the hand of Moscow. And in some cases that may be true, but in other cases it may not. It may just be a very convenient way to shut down dissent. And we all know, Benjamin Franklin's famous words that people who are willing to sacrifice their freedom for a little more security, they don't deserve neither freedom nor security. And it's clear every time a government is able to frame this issue as exclusively an issue about security, about life and death, and that you have to sacrifice your freedom in order to stay alive or to feel secure, you will always get less freedom, but that's no guarantee that you will be more secure.
Okay, and may I have a quick follow-up?
Well, we have a lot of questions, so maybe you can
okay, thank you very much.
You can get back in the queue if you want.
So, whenever I hear non-objectivists talk about free speech, and sometimes even objectivists, it's almost always the idea that social media are censoring us, that content policies are against free speech. You elaborated already on why that's incorrect, but why is it so pervasive? Why is it all that we hear about free speech?
Well, one reason is historically, I think John Stuart Mill has unfortunately a role in this. He's one of the chief seen as defenders of free speech in the classical liberal tradition, and I think he kind of represents the going awry of that tradition. So he treats social pressures and so forth as things that can coerce and stop speech, and I think that's really blurring the important line between force, which violates rights, and just refusing to be friends with someone who says things you don't like, which is an expression of rights. So I think the tenor and of many of the defenses of free speech going back quite a ways to at least Mill, that's one factor. And putting it less sort of historically and more from a standpoint of Mill and the people in a Millian vein have a point about something, which I think is right when they say this, but it's often confused with what I think is the important point about rights, and that gives rise to these confusions about content policy, for example. There are really two different things we need to distinguish that both go under the name of free speech, and I use free speech only for one of them, but the other one needs a different name. I don't have a great one. A policy of kind of openness in your communications. So if you take somebody who he won't even listen to anyone who says anything one hairbreadth different from him, and he never wants to talk to such a person, and he opens a business and will only serve people in the business who agree exactly with him, this guy is not violating free speech, as I understand it, but he's doing something kind of dumb and counterproductive and making his life worse. And if he has a school where nobody can ask questions or raise points that are at all at odds with what he, the teacher, thinks, it's not going to be a very good school. And so for different kinds of organizations, there are different kinds of content policies, different kinds of discussion policies that are worth having. But in all of them, there's a way to be too restricted, too closed, that ends up frustrating the goals of the organization. And for many organizations, it's you ought to value engaging with ideas different from your own, with having a community of people that don't all agree on everything that you could discuss things with. That is a real value. It is true that the truth best emerges when there's dissenting voices and conversation, and if certain views are excluded from being discussed, it's very hard then to know what's true because you're not hearing the best case for those views and so forth. So all of that, which is the kind of thing that Mill and others in a million veins stress when they're arguing for free speech, are true things. But they're true things about what a good way to run organizations of various sorts are, so as to promote the healthiest dialogues. And that's a separate question from what the right to free speech is. And I think it is reasonable to think that there's I think some of the kinds of policies on some of the social networks are not what I think would be the best policies. Not that I'm in a position to know what would be best for running a company this large, and it's very hard. But there are real concerns that some of the policies aren't making for the healthiest conversations. And that can easily be run together with that's violating our free speech rights if you don't have that distinction made clearly.
I'll say one other thing, that I think there's an element as well of a different confusion about rights. So I think a proper conception of individual rights, including the right to free speech, is it's about freedom of action. So you're free to take these kind of actions. It's not a guarantee of anything except a guarantee of protection from the government, that you will be free to take these actions. So the right to free speech is not a guarantee that anyone will listen, that you'll gain an audience, that you'll be able to build a platform. But the corruption in the idea of individual rights, it's been attacked from without, and it's been corrupted from within, that there's a notion of rights now that it's a guarantee to some kind of outcome. A right to Social Security or a right to healthcare is not a right. It's no longer thought of as a right to action. A right to Social Security, if there was such a thing, all there is the right to take actions to save for my retirement. There's no right to be handed the money from somebody else. But the more rights are thought about that, and if you put free speech like this, it's like I have a right to a platform, and I have a right to speak on any social media, and they're in the public domain, so they're not really private property. Everyone should be able to use, and anyone, use these in any kind of way. This is given to me. It's not something now that I have to earn. And the moment some private company says, no, on these terms, I don't want to deal with you, but I have a right. Now it means I have a handout that you're supposed to give me, and now that you're withdrawing. And I think for sure there's that mentality going on as well in the attacks on these companies.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jernas from the Netherlands. I had like two quick questions. Greg, Dr. Salmieri said that sometimes people frame it as like a left-right issue with free speech, but isn't it true that like the weakest side has the most to gain from limiting speech? So in that sense, it is like a right-wing issue, even though you could possibly be on the left and support free speech. And the second thing, it kind of goes into the question before. I totally get that we don't have a right to a Twitter account. Like, I fully agree. But isn't there a point where you're actually in a contract with Twitter and them breaking it might be a violation of your rights? Let's say if Twitter cancels like all these right-wing accounts 2 months before the election of 2020. And leave aside what the effect would be, because it could also help the right wing. But let's just assume it will be detrimental to getting the message out. If they do that and it's all like, oh, you violated something, oh, what did I violate? And you don't hear about it for 2 months, and then after 2 months they reinstate all these accounts. I do think that is some kind of violation of the contract, but so I'm wondering, where is the line of now government should fine them, or a judge should like, because some people have really a lot of money on these accounts with like the people they can reach, and I get that they don't have a right to it, but I do feel that it's like them and Twitter having an agreement, and if Twitter isn't fair in, you know, silencing them, they are kind of violating their rights, right?
I don't think so. I don't have a contract with Facebook.
But you did you signed something, right, when you made the account?
There's a user agreement about the terms, but it's not, I mean, a contract has valuable consideration in both directions. I mean, Facebook, I guess, can use the data it gets from me, but it's not a contractual relationship where I have a right to, I mean, if it was, then the contract would be their terms of service, and the terms of service are written such that they have the right, according to those terms of service, to cancel my account on what might turn out to be capricious grounds. So I just don't think there's really any plausible legal case there. Maybe if they did, if the contracts were written in a different way, then there might be, but I think their lawyers are too smart for that. And I think their lawyers are right to have the terms of service the way they do. Now, it might be for future social media companies that come up that are working to really attract people who are worried about being deplatformed. They might try to find a way to obligate themselves legally, and maybe that would be an interesting business model, but I don't think that's the case now. And the other question you asked is about, isn't free speech for the weaker side, or it's more important for the weaker side? I mean, I don't know that the right is the weaker side. In some quarters they are, in some they're not.
I said, isn't it in the advantage of the weaker side to limit speech? And I'm saying the left is the weaker side because they have the weakest argument. So I guess the less people speak, the better for them, right?
I think that's a very good question, and I think that's also one of the reasons why free speech is in decline, because of this misunderstanding and misperception. Especially in the US, on college campuses, there is this understanding that free speech somehow is the right to bigotry among the powerful, to attack minorities, and therefore free speech is in bad standing in many quarters in the US. And I think if you look at history, if you look at all movements for social change throughout history, be they movements for national independence in the former Soviet Union, which I just spoke about, Ukraine, the women's rights movements, the workers' movements, LGBT movement for equal rights, they have all benefited from freedom of expression. I mean, it's the weaker part's only weapon, because the powerful will marginalize, take away rights, suppress minorities all the way through history. And for them, the most important weapon is when they get the right to speak their case. So in fact, minorities are the one who should stand up for freedom of expression if you look at history, because the powerful will always get their way. It's the right of the individual to speak out for its rights against the will of the majority that really matters. So if you want social change, if you want equal rights for yourself, there is no better ally than freedom of expression.
Thank you.
I want to say one other issue on one other comment on this, which is you're bringing up weaker, stronger, and Flemming, you're talking about the weaker and the more powerful, and you're mixing two things together, and I think it's important to separate them. So, Flemming, I think you're talking about the political power and all these groups that have been disenfranchised and that have a better view. Their only chance is to be able to speak, and they should be on the side of freedom of speech. But then you put it in part of the question, or explaining your question, of the weaker arguments. And that's a very different notion. And I think there it's important to get the more irrational the viewpoint, that is, the more the viewpoint is not based on any reasons, evidence, arguments, logic, the more it will want to silence people speaking out, because they fear that it's going to be exposed. The more people are able to speak, to discuss ideas, it will be, look, but this whole viewpoint is fraudulent. There's no evidence, there's no reasons for it, we should abandon it. And so it's not an accident that religions censor, it's not an accident that Nazis censor, the communists censor. They fear the pursuit of knowledge. They fear people being free to think and free to speak, because knowledge will overturn their systems, because it's based on lies or worse.
Hello. So is free speech in the West in general under attack, or are those some random instances in Ivy League colleges, let's say, but because we live in a bubble, let's say libertarian objectivist bubble, we tend to over-exaggerate them? And the second one would be, are companies like Facebook and Twitter, should they be disallowed of deplatforming people once they get a lot of revenue from the government, or in their terms of condition, they that you sign, you accept that they might give some information to the government?
Before Onkar, Flemming was suggesting to help get through more questions, maybe we let several people ask their questions and then answer them in a batch, I guess. European style. So do you want to do that? Sure. All right. So we'll take a few questions and then we'll address them jointly.
Good morning. I have two questions. I wanted to ask about your views on legal defamation, and I wanted to ask, you said that the only reason that you can limit freedom of speech is incitement to violence. It's often implied, and it's not usually that direct, especially when there's, let's say, incitation to terrorism. So I wanted to ask, where would you draw the line on legal grounds? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Christina from Macedonia, and we have an alarming situation there about the freedom of speech. So even if the law says that you can express your opinion, if it's not assaultive or offending or violating that law, just stating some points we disagree with the politicians, the government, or the institutions, there are threats and pressure to delete our opinions posted on social media, or to just shut up. And how should we handle this situation? Because it's really, really alarming, and the people are starting to fear. It's like a dictatorship of some kind. Thank you.
So let's try to address those. I'll say a bit about the first questioner raised. So one is, I'm not totally sure I understood it, so you guys correct me if you think I have it wrong. Is there a chance that we are living in a bubble, those of us on the stage, and maybe in the audience as well, such that we're noticing certain attempts to shut down in various ways speech and not others, the ones that are more impactful on us and our friends, as opposed to people of different political views? And I think it is actually hard to tell that. Hard to tell, particularly in cases like what Facebook and YouTube are doing in their policies. So I have a number of people I went to graduate school with, not especially close with, but I'm friends with on Facebook, who are pretty hard left, Marxists and shut down, Occupy kind of people. And it's interesting to kind of look at their pages. And some of them were involved with some of the leftist pages that got taken down by Facebook that were partially run by Russian troll accounts or whatever it was, bots. And they were all upset, our progressive causes are being undermined and so forth. And they sounded like my friends on the right, who are similarly worried about their pro-Trump accounts and the Blacktivist account on the left. And so you do get cases of, this I don't think is censorship or free speech violation when Facebook takes these accounts down. But nonetheless, you do get cases of objections to and things being taken down on both the left and the right. It happens in both places. There's an issue of scale, and how do you tell what the scale is? And is it that certain right-wing views are under much more pressure or attack than left-wing views? We'd need some way to control for the bias in each of our source of information, that we're just located where we are in the world and see what we see and hear what we hear from our friends. I haven't seen, though perhaps there are, any good attempt to canvass all the cases of these things and count them up. I think that would be a useful thing for someone to do.
Just very briefly, I think we all tend to live in bubbles because we all belong to specific groups where there is a common understanding of things, and the big challenge for any group is to be able to live with dissenters without shutting them down or excluding them, and so on and so forth. And it's difficult for any group. On the question of the limitations of free speech, and I said in my introduction that I'm in favor of criminalizing incitement to violence. But what does that entail? Personally, I think I'm in favor of the American approach to limitations on free speech when it comes to the law and the First Amendment. American free speech doctrine is based on two principles. The first is viewpoint neutrality. That is, you can never criminalize speech based exclusively on its content. That means that there is no hate speech laws in the US. You have the legal right to say whatever you want about other people as long as it does not incite criminal action or violence. And the other principle of the American free speech doctrine is the clear and present danger test, which means when we talk about incitement to violence, there have to be a clear and present danger that violence will follow words in the very near future. And that's a big difference between the US and Europe. And I can just give you one example from the cartoon crisis. At the height of the cartoon crisis, there was a demonstration in front of the Danish embassy in London. And some of the demonstrators were showing placards saying, "Kill those who insult Islam." And they were arrested, and some of them, in fact, received pretty harsh prison sentences with a reference that this was incitement to violence. But there were no Danish cartoonists in London, and I was sitting in Copenhagen, so there was no threat that words would be followed by immediate action. If that had happened in the US, I don't think that these kind of words would have been criminalized in the same way as they are in Europe. I think one of the big changes in European law in the past 10-15 years is that we are criminalizing more and more words without this caveat that they have to imply incitement to violence. And one very clear example is glorification of terror. I mean, I think it's outrageous. I will criticize it. I think it's immoral, and I will fight it. But I don't think that it should be a criminal offense to glorify or praise terror, no matter how much I like it. Because if you go down that line, it's, what does it mean? At what point do you glorify terror and what point do you not? In France, after the 9/11 attack, a French cartoonist was in fact convicted for glorification of terror because he published a cartoon of the Twin Towers saying something like, everybody dreamed about it, Hamas did it. At that point, he didn't know that it was Al-Qaeda. I think it's a very offensive statement to all Americans and to all people who believe in freedom and democracy, but I don't think it should be a criminal offense. And we live in a time where more and more words are being criminalized just because they are offensive and not because they are inciting violence. And I think it makes it more and more difficult for us to manage our differences because a lot of speech will be pressed into the underground. And I think there those opinions will be more dangerous and more difficult to counter.
I think I have a little bit of a different view than in the sense that I have a very low tolerance, and I think a civilized society should have a very low tolerance for threats and for what qualifies as threats. And I don't think of this as I don't think of it as limitations on free speech. I think of it rather as thinking clearly what free speech is about. And if one connects it with the wider idea, it's about intellectual freedom, freedom of thought, freedom of speech. I think the reason, and I agree that it's important in the US that you can't criminalize speech for its content. It's because we're dealing with here the communication of ideas, the entertaining of viewpoints, the thinking about them, the debating of them. That is not a criminal activity and should not be criminalized. But there's all kinds of actions that involve speech that it's not right, I think, to think ever that they were thought of as we need a right that's protecting your freedom of action to do this. So, I mean, an example that I always give is if someone, and there are real cases like this, if someone robs a bank where all they bring is a note, they don't have even a gun on them, and they slip it to the teller, this is a robbery, hand over your money. And that's a threat, even though the person doesn't have a gun. And sometimes they're arrested and sometimes they get away with it. The money is handed over, they walk out of the bank, and they can't say, look, I'm just talking here. All I'm doing is talking to the teller. Why? This is my freedom of speech. You've introduced the force and a threat. I think the threat of force is force. And when the government says you cannot do this, what they're stopping is not an expression of ideas. What they're stopping is the use of force or a threat of force. And I'm surprised a little bit, Flemming, of your viewpoint, because I think in the sense of I have a very low threshold for death to those who insult Islam and so on. Not they're wrong and so on, but when it's death to those, it's the self-censorship works by a person having fear that something bad, but here it means force is going to descend upon them if they venture into this forbidden territory. And I think it should be a very low threat. There for sure are some things that you should be able to say about this. Like I think these people are really, these cartoonists are really bad. You would call, other people immoral and so on. But when it's death to them, I err on the side of you're introducing force here, and that is very dangerous, I think, because you're trying to intimidate. The whole thing is you're trying to intimidate and hoping the person will self-censor, I think, because they're scared now. And they're not scared of debate, they're scared of something else. So I have a very low threshold for threats.
There were one or two topics from that queue that we didn't get to. The three I remember, I'll just say something on one of them and remind us of the other two. One was, does it become censorship when a private company disallows you from saying something on its premises if that company's taking a lot of money from the government? Or at what point does it? There is a line that could be crossed when something's, nominally a private entity, but is basically an arm of the government. None of the social media platforms are within 1,000 years of being anything like that, in my view. And there's a tremendous danger since almost every company gets some preferential treatment from government and is a victim of some other preferential treatment from some other governments. If you think we can get some tax rebate or something this company got, therefore it's a wing of the government, therefore it has to act like a government, not like a private citizen. At a stroke, you've done away with all freedom everywhere in the world. So that's a super dangerous argument. You have to basically show that the thing is essentially a state actor before that argument can, I think, get any purchase and not be a real threat to liberty. And I don't think we're anywhere near that with any of the major internet companies. The other two was somebody asked about defamation law. And I don't know if one of you would like to speak to that. I don't have too much to say about it. And the other one, the young woman from Macedonia raised a number of points. I didn't quite capture them.
Yeah, I think the question you raised is very fundamental because it's about the relationship between law and culture. That freedom of expression can be protected by law, but in reality it doesn't exist because there is no culture of freedom, there is no culture of tolerance, there is no culture of being willing to accept dissent. And the powerful, they use threats and they may send the fire department to a newspaper 5 times a week in order to investigate us, or the tax police, or all kind of instruments to try to silence people who are critical of the government. So I've come to the understanding that, of course, the law is very important, and it's important that our rights are protected by law. But I think we have paid too little attention to what I will call cultures of freedom, and I think it's because throughout history, at least in the past 100 years, it's for the most part lawyers who have been dealing with free speech doctrines, and it's court cases that people discuss. But the more subtle trends when it comes to freedom of expression, they have not been explored fully. And I think, in fact, that a culture of freedom is at least as important as the law. And what to do? I mean, I was involved in the cartoon crisis in Denmark, and I have been living with a terrorist threat for quite some years, and the newspaper where I used to work is like a fort in peaceful Copenhagen, which is quite unusual in Denmark. And there are people who believe that this is exclusively something for the intelligence service, for the army, for law enforcement, police, and so on and so forth. And of course, that's important that these institutions of power protect the rights of people. But I think when it comes to terrorism and threats, what is the point of terrorism? It is to terrorize. It is to use the threat of force or commit violence in order to change your behavior or change your beliefs. And I think that the most powerful weapon against terrorism is not to let these people terrorize you. That is, you do not give in to intimidation, threats, and violence in order to silence you. Because if you do that, you will not get less of it, you will get more of it because you show that it works. So why stop? And the Rushdie case we spoke about is a very good example. At one point, Rushdie, in fact, apologized and converted to Islam because he thought that it would calm down his opponents and it will give him peace of mind. And he recognized that was the most grave mistake of his life. And if you give them a finger, they want the whole hand, and so on and so forth. So the best way to fight this is to keep on speaking out and not submit to fear. And that is very difficult. And I do not call on people to put their lives on the line, but we just have to accept that there is a price to be paid for freedom when some people want to take it away from us.
So I just want to say we're cutting into the coffee break now, so I allowed 2 more questions. So if you could keep the answers brief, thank you.
Okay.
There have been instances of social media platforms collaborating with
foreign regimes to help them suppress their own people, such as Google was working on developing a censored search engine. And they're an American-based company, and they are helping these foreign powers do this with their own citizens. So how should one think about this in regard to free speech and censorship? Thank you.
I think it is concerning, and I'm much more concerned about Google and Facebook engage in this kind of activity than I am about them deplatforming some who they think is violating their terms of service, even if you think they're sort of very inconsistently apply their terms of service and their standards. So there's a whole, I think the broader context to think about this issue is how do companies in the Western world or who operate in largely free nations, when they go into countries like China that are essentially not free, where the government has all kinds of arbitrary power over its citizens, how do you operate in those countries? And I think the companies have to think a lot about how to do this properly, and there's all kinds of illegitimate things that you can do. But the reason that they would want to go in, aside from sort of the business reasons, is it is part of how these countries open up. And if you're operating, Apple operating in China, Google and Facebook trying to do it, and if they're on the premise of they're trading with people who are voluntarily trading with them to the extent that these people can act voluntarily in those countries, it's legitimate to do. You are empowering the people there, and over the long term, I think, undermining those communist and authoritarian governments. But you can easily cross the line to where even you might think you're doing that, but what you're actually doing is helping the governments oppress their people. And when it gets to the point that they're creating search engines and so on that do this, I think they have to think that censor in various kinds of ways according to what the government dictates are. They really have to think about whether they should do this, whether they're providing enough information where it's still better for the citizens in these countries to have access to Google censored than to have access to no information at all. But they have to be very careful. And I thought it was a good thing that people within Google, within the company, are protesting, like, are we doing this in the right kind of way? And to get the company really thinking about this. Are we on the side of freedom and liberty and thought and speech, or are we actually on the side of the oppressive governments? And I think it's a very, very difficult issue to navigate, and it takes a lot of thought, and it's easy to fool yourself to what you're doing when that's not really the right way to describe what you're actually doing. And it's good that the companies are thinking about this, and that employees in the companies are thinking about this.
Hi, I'll be quick. So as you said at the beginning, the globalization has basically made our entire Earth a global village. So we have divergent groups of people living next to each other, and obviously we all strive for peace. We want to live in a peaceful environment. So kind of my question and comment is, why would I provoke you or something that's really important to you if I know that my action will really make you feel offended? And isn't there such a thing as your freedom stops where mine starts? Thank you.
I suspect that was primarily to you.
I think that was a question for me. Am I right?
Kind of.
Well, to take the last first, I also heard that argument during the Khartoum crisis, that my freedom stops at the end of your nose or something like that. And this is in fact a reference to John Stuart Mill, whom Greg mentioned. but people get it totally wrong. My freedom stops when exercising my freedom prevents you from exercising your freedom. And publishing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad or of somebody else that may be offensive to some people does not prevent you from exercising your rights. As I said, unfortunately, a lot of people today believe that they have a right not to be offended. And I think that's wrong. I think in a democracy you have many rights. You have the right to freedom of expression, to freedom of religion, to freedom of assembly. We vote, freedom of movement, and so on and so forth. But the only right you do not have in democracy is a right not to be offended. And that's what we have to learn. The other thing is, should you publish something when you know in advance that it's going to offend a lot of people? Yes, you should, if you think it's right and if it fits your values and an understanding of the case. And if you are having the cartoon crisis in mind, I can tell you that even though I didn't know a lot about Islam at the time, and I had a crash course in the years after that, even experts on Islam in Denmark in the fall of 2005 said this is never going to be a big international crisis. And there have been published cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad and images of the Prophet Muhammad, and even a lot of Muslims do not know that there is no ban on images of the Prophet in the Quran. There are a few sentences in the hadiths, but it's more about that you don't have a right to create living images, and that's why you don't have any depictions of people in mosques while you have it in churches. It has also to do with the fact that at the time of the Prophet, people were afraid of competing religions, so if you create graven images, there will be competitors. And I always say I don't think that the cartoons I published present a competitor to believing Muslims. They will not, praise these images that we published. But the cartoon crisis is interesting because the cartoons were being published in a specific context in Denmark. And when the information then traveled to other parts of the world, the context was lost. And the cartoons were not published, out of the blue. They were published as a reaction and part of a debate about self-censorship, violence, threats, or intimidation in Denmark and Western Europe when it comes to talking about Islam. And there were cartoonists who were saying, we are afraid of making illustrations for a children's book about the life of the Prophet. Images were being taken down from museums because they were being perceived as offensive. Stand-up comedians were saying, we are not afraid of making fun of the Bible, but we will not do the same with the Quran. And you had a lot of examples and incidents of self-censorship when it comes to talking about Islam. And some people were saying, well, there is no self-censorship. Other people were saying, well, there is self-censorship. And that was the context in which I commissioned those cartoons in order to find out, to let people who are working with images as their medium to express themselves when it comes to this alleged ban or fear of challenging Islam in one way or the other. And I received 12 cartoons, and they were very different in the ways they depicted the Prophet and whom they targeted for satire. But all that context, and I think in fact that that commissioning cartoons is a very civilized way to react to threats, intimidation, and violence, and it's a way of keeping the conversation within a civilized frame. And if I may end with one situation that I describe in my book, which has to do with the terrorist attack in Madrid in 2004. A woman whom I happened to interview, her husband was killed in the terrorist attack in Madrid. He was on a train traveling that morning, March 11, 2004. And this woman appeared in the court wearing a t-shirt with the cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad with a bomb in his turban to express what she was thinking about the terrorists. And I think the irony about this is, I mean, who is offended here? Is it the woman who lost her husband due to murder committed by people in the name of the Prophet and their religion, or alleged religion? Or is it the perpetrators of a crime who are offended because she showed up in court wearing a t-shirt depicting the Prophet in a way she identifies with? And the irony of that cartoon is, in fact, that it depicts a certain part of reality. It is true that there are people who have committed violence and murder in the name of the Prophet several times in Europe. It doesn't mean that all Muslims are terrorists or the Prophet was a terrorist. It just means that that cartoon expresses a specific reality. And the irony is, I think, that some Muslims who threatened me and the cartoonist were saying, if you say that we are violent, then we are going to kill you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Flemming. Thank you for the good questions. So it's time for a coffee break, but we want to make a group photo. And I've been told that it's going to be a big challenge with this many people. So could you please try and just, as fast as possible, go to the end of the foyer where we've removed the tables. Find a place to stand, also down the stairs and on the next floor downstairs. And we're going to have a photographer.